Hi guys, my name is Grace Cordial. I am the manager of the Beaufort County Library's Special Local History Collection and Archives Unit, the Beaufort District Collection. We concentrate on the people, places, and themes in local history, Gullah culture, and the natural environment of Beaufort County, Jasper County, and Hampton County in the South Carolina Lowcountry. First, a little housekeeping. Today we have Dr. Eric Plaag on deck to discuss his most recent book, The Means of Grace, A History of the Robertville Baptist Church. We are delighted to have the Beaufort County Historical Society and Carolina Historical Consulting, LLC, as co-sponsors for this local history program. The Means of Grace is already on the branch library's local history shelves waiting for you to borrow a copy. For those of you who like to own books, Dr. Plaag will be able to help you with that after the program concludes. My job as the Beaufort District Collection Manager includes sharing local history with the community through our research room, on social media, and through local history programs. While I have been so pleased with the attendance of virtual programs we've done so far during the COVID situation, I am thrilled, beyond thrilled, to announce that the next BDC local history program is planned as an in-person event. Yay! To maximize benefit, for smooth reception, please mute your microphone and turn off your video camera. My job, once Dr. Plaag begins, is to keep up with what's happening in the chat room. Please put your questions there so that I may relay them to him to answer at the conclusion of the program. Now, on to the formal introduction. Today, our focus is on a very historic and beautiful Baptist church in Hampton County. The Black Swamp, also known as the Robertville Baptist Church, began in Beaufort District over 200 years ago and remains active today. Dr. Plaag has written the first comprehensive history of the church's past, drawing on research materials held by state and county governments, church archives, and special collections in the Carolinas, including a few things from our own Beaufort District collection. Dr. Plaag is well suited to the task put before him by the church's congregation to write its history. From his 10-page curriculum vitae, here are a few items directly relative to his work on this book. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Religion from the College of William and Mary. He has a Master's in Fine Arts and Creative Writing from George Mason University. He earned his Ph.D. in History from the University of South Carolina and has specialized in United States history to 1877 and public history. He is the founder and principal consultant of Carolina Historical Consulting, LLC, a genealogist, and is the author of a dozen commissioned histories, including Means of Grace, The Case for Port Royal, Interpreting the Reconstruction Era National Monument, and Sherman's March through South Carolina. He has researched and submitted more than 24 National Register of Historic Places applications, including several located within the confines of the former Beaufort District. He's taught at a number of colleges and universities since the 1990s. Dr. Plaag lives and works and is broadcasting today from Boone, North Carolina, where the town loves him so much, they declared February 25th, 2018 as Dr. Eric Plaag Day. Please join me in what is sure to be an engaging and informative presentation about the history of the Robertville Baptist Church and its members.
Thank you, Grace, very much. I appreciate it. So I want to start just by telling you how I came to know about the Robertville Baptist Church. I actually discovered it in 2012. I realized obviously that I was not the first to discover it, but I was driving up 321 as part of mapping work I was doing on the Sherman's March project that year. And just kind of was struck when I got to the Robertville intersection to find this gorgeous, large church in a part of South Carolina that I would not have expected to find such a noteworthy church. I was also taken by the J.C. Richardson House, which is located across the highway on Gillison Branch Road from the church. And shortly thereafter, I asked my friend Lawton Clark O'Kane a little bit about both the church and the house, and was soon introduced to Gloria Langford Tootin, whose husband, Redden Tootin, was the pastor at the church. And over time, not only did I assist Gloria in getting the J.C. Richardson House, which she owns, listed on the National Register of Historic Places, but we also became friends. And as part of that friendship, I knew that Gloria really wanted to see somebody write a comprehensive history of the church. And over time, she persuaded the other members of her congregation to basically commission me to write that book for them. The project from the beginning was very complicated and difficult because unfortunately no church minutes for either the Black Swamp Baptist Church, which was the first iteration of this church, or the Robertville Baptist Church survived prior to the 1920s. And the minutes from the 1920s to 1953 are pretty scattered and thin. So it meant that I didn't really have the church's own voice in telling its story very well for the period from the 1780s up to 1953. And that meant that I had to rely on other sources to begin to piece together the history and the story of the church. So over the next 5 years, I conducted research at more than a dozen, or almost a dozen, archival repositories in both South and North Carolina. And then I spent about 2 years of writing and editing on the book project. And the book was finally published last month in October. And I'll tell you a little bit later about how to obtain a copy of the book if you're interested. So we're going to start with a little bit on the history overall of the church. I'm not going to take you through every last piece of history about the church from the book. We would be here for days, I think, if I tried to do that, but I want to hit some high points. And first, despite numerous sources claiming without attribution that the Black Swamp Baptist Church was established in 1781, actual constitution of the church occurred on February 11, 1786. An 1831 petition for state incorporation of the church, submitted by members of the congregation, confirms that 1786 date as the origin date for the congregation. This new church was established following Henry Holcomb's decision to move the existing Savannah River Carolina Church from the Matthews Bluff area to the Pipe Creek vicinity in 1785. Apparently some members of the congregation were still concerned, despite that move, about the travel distance from the Black Swamp area to the new church at Pipe Creek. So 8 of those members of the Pipe Creek congregation asked for dismission from the congregation to create a new mission at Pipe Creek that would be called Black Swamp. Months later, the Black Swamp mission asked for its independence from the Pipe Creek Church, which was granted. That first church was apparently located near the extant Robert Cemetery on Tie Branch Road, just a little bit to the north of the Robertville crossroads. On your screen, you can see the 1855 plat of the graveyard for the Robert Cemetery. You'll notice that no church building is shown, and we don't actually know where exactly that first church was located in relationship to the graveyard. But it's believed that it was located in this vicinity. Originally a member of the Charleston Association of Baptist Churches, the Black Swamp congregation was also frustrated with the distance to Charleston for association meetings. So in 1802, Black Swamp joined several other area churches in leaving the Charleston Association for the Savannah River Baptist Association. Black Swamp and its later iteration, the Robertville Baptist Church, remained members of the Savannah River Baptist Association until 1971, when the Robertville Church joined the Allendale Hampton Baptist Association. So early on, during the early 19th century, the Black Swamp congregation was actually threatened by a large outmigration that occurred in waves from basically Beaufort District to the Mississippi Territory. And there was concern that the church might not survive as a result of that outmigration. So they engaged in a series of revivals around that same time that swelled church membership to 164 members in 1813. Subsequent revivals at Black Swamp helped establish the nearby Cypress Creek and Steep Bottom missions, which later became congregations of their own. And as a result of that influence on the growth of churches in the area, Black Swamp became known to many 20th century commentators as the mother of churches in Hampton and Jasper counties. Meanwhile, about 1809, the village of Robertville was established as a corporate concern a few miles to the south of the Tie Branch Road site, with 7 acres of the 82-acre parcel reserved as a parsonage lot for the Black Swamp Baptist Church, perhaps as early as 1810 and certainly by 1815. What you're seeing here is a plat of the Robertville parcel prior to its conversion to the Robertville corporate entity. This is the original 82-acre parcel that was sold in 1808. Circumstantial evidence suggests that the Black Swamp congregation moved the church building from the Robert Cemetery to the present church site around this same time, sometime in the roughly 1815, perhaps a few years earlier range of dates. So to understand what you're looking at on this parcel, your key to the right there shows that the directional to the north. And so the road coming in from the upper left of the map is essentially what we think of as US 321 now, continuing down as the Perrysburg Road toward the lower right. And then what we understand as Sisters Ferry Road or Robertville Road is the small road going off to the left just above the pond. And then going off to the right, which labeled as the Coosawhatchee Road, is actually what's now known as the Gillison Branch Road. And at kind of the center of the map, you can see the Tie Branch Road angling up toward the top of the map. So in terms of this plat, it doesn't show the actual site of what would eventually become the Black Swamp and Robertville church sites. That was located in that wedge to the upper left corner where you see the Augusta Road and the Sisters Ferry roads coming together just above the pond. After moving the church to that site, sometime probably around 1815, the church also established an academy in 1818 just south of the present church site. This period represented the pinnacle of Black Swamp's influence on the region and the Savannah River Baptist Association. You also saw during this period the construction of a new church in 1824, which you see depicted in this image from about 1860. With the old church kind of attached to the back of this new church as for use as a Sunday school and a nursery. They then added a cemetery parcel in 1833 at Robertville, which is also located to the southwest of the present church site. During this period, the church was host to the 1830 State Baptist Convention and was credited as, quote, the very first apparent impulse, close quote, for a series of revivals throughout the state of South Carolina in 1831. By 1840, Black Swamp had 7 pastors who were licensed to preach throughout the state, and some sources claim that the church produced a total of 50 white pastors and 100 Black pastors before the 19-teens. During the antebellum period, St. Peter's Parish, the part of Beaufort District where Black Swamp was located, had a roughly 4-to-1 ratio of enslaved individuals to free individuals. And among those free people, the ratio of free whites to free people of color was only 2-to-1. So whites actually comprised a very tiny portion of the overall population of St. Peter's Parish and of the Robertville vicinity during the antebellum period. As early as the 1820s, Black Swamp members were trying to strictly police Black movement, probably largely as a result of fear of potential slave rebellions. In 1823, for example, the Black Swamp Association, whose leadership included several prominent figures from the Black Swamp Church, unsuccessfully petitioned for official state incorporation as an organization with a stated purpose of, quote, better governing and managing Negroes and other persons of color, close quote. Just 3 years earlier, church member Benjamin Jardin had been prosecuted for, quote, unlawfully trading with Blacks, close quote, in a scheme that involved using free Blacks to serve as fences of goods procured by the enslaved that were then sold to Jardin, and he, of course, then in turn sold those items elsewhere at market. In 1834, the Black Swamp Church also passed a resolution mandating compulsory church attendance by Black members, with harsh penalties for failure to do so. The other issue that was prominent at this period of time, and to give you a sense of membership during this period, enrollments were typically between 300 and 400 members from 1830 to 1860. And peak membership occurred in 1864 when there were 540 members of the church, 90% of whom were Black. So there was great concern, as I mentioned, over control of this Black population. But there are also ongoing questions about the morality of slavery during this period. And in 1841, the Black Swamp Church endorsed a pro-slavery resolution designed to preserve the slaveholder to enslaved relationship. And in 1845, the church backed the break from the Triennial Convention over the question of whether slaveholding was morally legitimate. That schism among Southern churches resulted in the formation of the separatist Southern Baptist Convention that year, and it was specifically over slavery that break occurred. Shortly thereafter, by 1848, the Black Swamp Church also created a separate Black mission at present-day Tillman, which appears to have been part of an effort to have Blacks worship separately from whites, albeit under white supervision. So at this point, I actually want to break from my notes and read an excerpt from the book to give you not only a sense of how the book reads, but also to cover what I think is one of the most exciting parts of Robertville and Black Swamp's history in relationship to this question of slavery and the relationship among these different groups of people at Robertville. The existence of this Black mission near Robertville and the presence of Black deacons within the Black Swamp Baptist Church should not be mistaken as a sign that all was blissfully calm within the Black Swamp community. Indeed, some enslaved persons at Robertville were becoming sufficiently bold to call out their white enslavers about problems caused by the evils of the slave institution. One enslaved woman even suggested that the genesis of these evils rested at Black Swamp Baptist itself. Writing to her plantation mistress, almost certainly Alexander J. Lawton's second wife Cordelia, in July 1849, an apparently well-educated enslaved woman named Lavinia questioned the decision to give her daughter Aggie's husband, Jimmy, to Judy, quote, a base woman more worse than Mary Magdalene, close quote, pointedly asking her mistress at the opening of her letter, do you think it right in the sight of God? Lavinia's utterly extraordinary missive went on to describe a hotbed of fornication on the plantation where she resided, all as a result of Judy's past history with other women's husbands, and her efforts to pry Jimmy from his marriage to Aggie. Lavinia then reminded her mistress that she had interceded to prevent Lavinia's husband, Christmas, from being sent to Mrs. Winborn Lawton's place the previous year, asking that she now prevent Master Jimmy from being paired with Judy. Holding nothing back, Lavinia was even more direct, calling on what she had learned in church to speak of the sinfulness of the situation. Quote, "View the matter as you would if they were your children. Have they not souls as well as white people? Do not allow such adultery. Why did you tell Massa you were willing for him to have Judy? One preacher going to have another preacher's daughter. Great right holders. They preach in the works of the devil. What does the Bible say? Must Aggie's life be taken for the sake of Judy? My God, take your word back. You requested Massa to let him have her. Massa Henry could have stopped it if you had not given your consent. This accounts for the cold state the Black Swamp Church is in because there is so much devils in it. Where is your conscience? Pray over it, Massa, and see if you can allow it." Close quote. Indeed, the moral problem of slavery was a recurring topic of concern for members of the Black Swamp community as early as the 1830s. One such individual was Joseph Thomas Robert, the son of Charlotte Ann Lawton Robert and James Yehu Robert, the latter a deacon for many years at Black Swamp. Educated at the Black Swamp Academy, Joseph Thomas Robert attended the Columbian College in Washington, D.C., beginning in 1824, then shifted to Rhode Island's Brown University in 1825, graduating in 1828. The following year, Robert enrolled at the Medical College at Yale University, then returned home to marry his cousin, Adeline Elizabeth Lawton, the daughter of Black Swamp Baptist deacon Alexander J. Lawton, while enrolling at the Charleston Medical College. The return home to services at Black Swamp Baptist accordingly changed his life. Moved deeply by the revival of 1831, shortly after his graduation from medical school, Robert abandoned his medical career to enroll at Furman Theological Institute. In 1832, Black Swamp Baptist granted him a license to preach, then ordained him in 1834, and he served as Black Swamp's principal pastor until 1839. From 1831 to 38, Robert also served as a messenger of Black Swamp Baptist to the Savannah River Baptist Association. About 1839, for reasons that are not entirely clear, Robert suddenly left for pastorates in the Midwest, first at Covington, Kentucky, then at Lebanon, Ohio. Shortly after his departure in March 1840, Robert appears to have sold several of the people he had enslaved to his father-in-law, Alexander J. Lawton. Those four enslaved individuals were none other than Lavinia, the author of the letter I read, and her three children. Life in the North did not initially stick for Robert, and there's good reason to believe, as we shall see, that he was walking a tightrope between obeying his conscience and keeping his wife and her powerful father content. On July 1, 1846, Robert resigned his pastorate at Lebanon and returned home to the South, serving first as pastor for the First Baptist Church in Savannah, then returning as pastor to Black Swamp Baptist in 1849. The stay was brief, and one must wonder whether three events around the same time, a direct confrontation between a traveling abolitionist and the people of Robertville in early 1848, the visit of Robert's abolitionist cousin by marriage, William Henry Brisbane, in January 1849, and the dispute brought up in July 1849 by Lavinia, the enslaved woman on his father-in-law's plantation, whether these items played a role in influencing Robert's views on slavery. By 1851, Robert had left Black Swamp once again for Ohio, this time taking up the pastorate at Temple Baptist Church in Portsmouth. Once there, Robert invited Brisbane to speak at Robert's church on the higher and lower laws with regard to fugitive slaves. Of the first of those influential events, relatively little is known. In May 1848, numerous newspapers throughout the country reported on an inquest held at Barnwell, South Carolina, located 50 miles north of Robertville, for the purpose of removing an admitted abolitionist known only as Dr. L. Major, who had been stirring up trouble throughout Beaufort District. Reports suggested that Major had been seen in a field conversing with the slaves who were gathered around him, that the owner of these slaves ordered him off, and questioned the slaves as to what they had been told by Dr. Major, but they would not answer, and that the citizens of Robertville had threatened to take him up, and that he had expressed surprise that slaves were not permitted to sit and eat at the same table with their owners. Witnesses also accused Major of possum hunting with Negroes in order to deliver philosophical lectures on freedom, and, quote, carrying about him a chemical preparation to change the color of the skin, close quote. Most egregious of all in the eyes of residents of South Carolina was that Major, quote, was traveling with a female not believed to be a white person, close quote. Major acknowledged that he, quote, had challenged the citizens of Robertville to hold a public meeting to hear his views on slavery, but denied having harangued the slaves or interfered with the institution, close quote. The Barnwell Committee nevertheless ran him out of town. This outcome appears to have had little effect on Dr. Major, who made repeated attempts in Beaufort District to continue his abolitionist cause. In mid-May 1848, local residents turned Major and his assistant, Hannah Aburn, away from a lecture at Duck Savannah, a plantation just north of the Coosawhatchee River near Duck Branch and just over the line in Allendale. He avoided a scheduled lecture that same week at nearby Matthews Bluff, fearing a similar outcome, and instead made his way toward Lawtonville. Anticipating his arrival, approximately 50 local residents gathered to discuss their options. After testimony from several locals about their interactions with Major, the body approved several unanimous resolutions, including that Major and Aburn be considered, quote, dangerous emissaries, and that a committee of 11 be appointed to effect their speedy removal from this parish, close quote. They also agreed to refuse shelter to any abolitionist and to regard any citizen who gave countenance to Major and Aburn as persons, quote, inimical to the interests of the South, close quote, who should be treated accordingly. Dr. Major's exploits in 1848 are fascinating, given Robertville's already extant anxiety over one of its native-born sons, once a vehement defender of slavery, who had changed his mind on the issue. Born at Black Swamp in 1806, William Henry Brisbane had spent his early life with an adoptive uncle north of Charleston and at school in Vermont and Middletown, Connecticut. When he returned to South Carolina, he was baptized at the Pipe Creek Church, several miles north of Robertville, served as a delegate to the association meeting in 1826, and enrolled at Furman Theological Institute. Pipe Creek extended Brisbane a license to preach by 1829, then it ordained him by 1930, with Brisbane serving as one of Pipe Creek's pastors until 1837. In the midst of his pastorate, however, Brisbane became consumed with doubt about the morality of slavery, particularly a thorny problem for him as a substantial slaveholder. His first brush with the arguments of the abolitionist cause came on November 8, 1833, when his perusal of an abolitionist pamphlet threw him into a rage. Hours later, though, the argument began to take hold of him, even as he used his position as editor of the Southern Baptist and General Intelligencer to fire off scripture-based defenses of slavery for years to follow. The arrival at his office in 1835 of an abolitionist excerpt from Francis Wayland's Elements of Moral Science only further agitated Brisbane, and he began to realize the contortionist nature of the arguments he continued to make in defense of slavery. While still arguing publicly in 1835 for the justifiability of slavery, Brisbane quietly began preparing to emancipate those he had enslaved, overhauling the operation of his plantations in the process by dismissing his overseer, banning punishment by the whip, and leaving the plantation largely in control of those he enslaved. The response from his neighbors to just these changes was immediate and harsh, with rumors making the rounds that he must be a closeted abolitionist. Brisbane later reported that he was threatened with arrest by the authorities, as well as vigilante justice in the form of tarring and feathering. Parishioners frequently walked out when he ascended the pulpit. Out of fear of this public pressure, Brisbane sold most of the people he had enslaved to his brother-in-law, Edward Peoples, rather than manumitting them, then left for a pastorate in Cincinnati, Ohio in February 1838. Nevertheless, Brisbane continued to study on the subject, and by 1839, he found slavery no longer defensible in any form. He freed the 3 enslaved people he had taken with him to Ohio, then returned home to attempt to buy back his former servants so that he could free them outright. Spurned by his brother-in-law, Brisbane then set up a secret trust to purchase his former enslaved hands whenever they became available for sale, then set them free. About the same time, Brisbane's fiery 1839 speech before the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society of Cincinnati cemented his national reputation as a full-fledged abolitionist, the Southerner who had come to his senses and renounced the traditions of his slaveholding kinsmen. In December 1841, Brisbane returned again to South Carolina, having finally succeeded in acquiring all but one of those he had formerly enslaved by repurchasing them from peoples at a significant profit well over market price. Securing their safety, Brisbane personally accompanied the 28 men, women, and children to Ohio for the explicit purpose of setting them free. By January 1849, Brisbane was a national voice on the moral imperative of abolition and the gross immorality of slavery. That month, a planned visit to Beaufort District to reconnect with family and friends must have been accompanied by some feelings of concern about how he would be received, especially in light of Dr. L. Major's antics just months earlier. The trip, according to eyewitness Georgia Lawton Morgan, did not go well. After one night at the Lawtonville plantation of his wife's relatives, Brisbane and his wife took off in the middle of the night. Quote, "When I was old enough to understand," Lawton Morgan remembered, "my mother told me that Uncle Stoney, who was the neighborhood physician, and a younger brother of my father had learned that a number of the crackers, or the lower class in that vicinity, were going to take Uncle William out and tar and feather him that night. So my father and his brother, Dr. James Stoney Lawton, and a few other gentlemen of the neighborhood that had spirited Dr. Brisbane off. Aunt Anna was welcomed by her relations, but he had lost the love of his own people," close quote. It should not be surprising then that the treatment of Brisbane and the subsequent crisis brought to light by Lavinia's complaints just 6 months later, while Joseph Thomas Robert was again pastor at Black Swamp Baptist, likely had a profound effect on Robert. Throughout the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, Brisbane and Robert maintained a regular correspondence and often visited one another. It seems certain that they must have discussed abolitionist ideas during the 1840s. It was in this context that Robert invited Brisbane to speak at his Ohio church in January of 1852 and deliver the aforementioned anti-slavery address to his congregation. Nevertheless, there were still tensions within the two immediate families. When Robert took a faculty position at Burlington University in Iowa in 1857, Brisbane and his wife visited, and the nearby First Baptist Church offered Brisbane their open pastorate. But the coolness of Adeline Robert to Brisbane's anti-slavery views prompted Brisbane to decline the position so as to avoid further tensions with relatives back in Robertville. Indeed, Adeline had good reason to worry. Her husband's discomfort with slaveholding was already sufficiently evident to her father that in his 1851 will, Alexander J. Lawton included a provision addressing the possibility that Adeline might, quote, "not desire to keep the slave property she may inherit under this will," close quote, in which case her brothers were to keep the slaves and instead pay her a fair valuation for them. When he revised his will in February 1862, after the outbreak of hostilities in the Civil War, Lawton essentially cut his own daughter out of the will, indicating, quote, "As my much loved daughter is now a citizen of the United States with whom the Confederate States are at war, and as she is regarded by our laws as an alien enemy whose property is liable to sequestration, I am thereby deprived of the power to carry out my desire to put her on the same footing with my other children." He then left it to his sons to apportion from their shares at some later date an amount to her, quote, "in the manner I would certainly do if permitted by the laws of the country," close quote. These tensions with Adeline's father were no doubt enhanced by the decision of Henry Martin Robert, the son of Adeline and Joseph Thomas Robert, and today probably Black Swamp's most famous former member as the author of Robert's Rules of Order, to serve in the Union Army and remain in the North, given that Adeline's brother, Alexander R. Lawton, was an officer and eventually quartermaster general for the Confederate Army. Fortunately, when the war was over, all seems to have been repaired. Joseph Thomas Robert writing to his father-in-law in August 1865 to express his delight that Alexander J. Lawton still cared for them, given Robert's longstanding fears that they would never hear from him again. Robert soon returned to the South in 1871, settling in Georgia and spending the rest of his career as a missionary and educator of the freed people of the state. Brisbane's relationship to the South and Beaufort District in particular, once the war began, was no less auspicious, although it remained contentious. Shortly after Port Royal fell to Union forces, Brisbane was appointed in 1862 as one of the federal direct tax commissioners in South Carolina, charged with assessing taxes on land parcels in the captured areas of the coast, repossessing them when their Confederate owners did not come forward, and selling them to the freed persons at the heart of the Port Royal experiment. 6 months later, at a grand celebration on January 1, 1863 at Camp Saxton in Port Royal, Brisbane had the striking honor of being the first person to read aloud Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation to the very people who had been freed by it. In that moment, his rejection of and redemption from his own roots as a slaveholder became complete. The war would have profound consequences for Black Swamp Baptists, not only dividing white families from one another for a time, but also giving rise to a complete and often contentious racial split within the church membership during the Reconstruction period. Still, in the years leading up to the war, Black Swamp remained a vibrant congregation, even with tensions over slaveholding constantly percolating in the background. So going back to the notes part of the presentation, waiting for the slide to catch up here. The Civil War really didn't reach its pinnacle in terms of its influence on the Robertville area in particular until 1865, and specifically January of 1865, when Sherman's men not only crossed at Savannah and part of the 20th Army Corps came up along the Perrysburg Road, but also the 14th and 20th Army Corps, the balance of those forces, along with Kilpatrick's cavalry, crossed at Sisters Ferry. And the first place that many of those different regiments stopped was at Robertville. There's been a perception that the church was burned along with the rest of Robertville in late January of 1865. And I think that's influenced by the knowledge that there were forces at Robertville by the 29th of January. And you see that in this map here. If you look at Robertville there near the top of the map, you can see little marks representing the different groups that were there. And then there are numbers expressed as what appears to be a fraction. The 30/1 means January 30, the 4/2 means February 4. And so that gives you an idea when these different groups were reaching the area around Robertville. What's neat is that in my research, I already had quite a bit of material from the Sherman's March project on the passing through this area of Sherman's men. And it was very evident from soldier diaries and other accounts that I had accumulated that the church was still intact early in the morning of February 6th. There's a diary entry from a man who describes it. He actually makes reference to, I think it's fairly humorous. He describes seeing many of his fellow soldiers approaching the church and trying to set their watches to the clock in the tower, which was a painted on clock. Even the hands were painted on. It was not a working clock. And he found great amusement in that. But we then have an account from another soldier who passes through Robertville early in the afternoon, and the church by that point has been burned. So we can actually pinpoint to a roughly 5-hour window on February 6th when the church was burned. As you can imagine, the burning of the church and of the village at Robertville, essentially nothing was left at Robertville. There's an old story that only a well curb was left standing, that everything else was completely destroyed. This devastated the Black Swamp community. And it would take, and there's another piece to this that goes along with this. Immediately after the war, with freedom, many Black parishioners had absolutely no interest whatsoever in continuing to worship with their former enslavers. And so many Black parishioners went off and formed their own churches. So if you think of, Black Swamp Baptist having a roughly 560 member congregation and 90% of that congregation leaving following the end of hostilities to go form their own churches, you can imagine the impact that that had on the congregation and the church as a whole. So the congregation spent about 6 years trying to get itself back on track. They met in a small shack of a store that was thrown up there at Robertville shortly after the war for a while. There's some indication that they may have met in a brush arbor for a while. And then eventually in 1871, they approached members of a congregation that had largely disbanded from the Ascension Church, an Episcopal church at Gillisonville, and they acquired that church. There are some legends that say that the church was rolled on logs from Gillisonville. There's really very little evidence to support that. More likely, the church was disassembled. There is some circumstantial evidence to suggest this is what happened, because there are still Roman numerals on the windows and their corresponding window frames, suggesting there was some effort to match up the windows to their appropriate openings once the disassembled church reached its new location. So that was completed in 1871. The church had a brief revival that lasted until the early 1880s. And then really from about 1882 into the 1920s, the church was largely dormant during that period. Had a few occasions where members would try to get things going again, but it was not very active. Finally, in the 1920s, there was another revival that was short-lived. And it wasn't until 1953 that the church really got back on its feet and reestablished, in large part through the efforts of the Langford family and some of the other families at Robertville who wanted to see the church reopened and used for worship. The last two chapters of the book describe these lean years and then talk about really the 20th century history of the church. They closely follow the minutes. There are some additional sources that were consulted, but because we have that great minutes record from 1953 on, that last chapter really focuses on what the minutes tell us about the activities of the church. I think that really the 20th century history of the church kind of peaks in multiple activities that they're engaged in the 1970s to preserve the church, including listing of the church on the National Register in 1972, along with a resurgence of interest in some renovations and seeking legal protection under a 1993 Jasper County ordinance for the protection of historical and archaeological sites. Today, the church remains active in what is now its 235th year of service to the Robertville community. And the church looks pretty much as you see it there in this picture, which was taken in 2014. If you've never been, I urge you to go. It's a beautiful church, and it really is quite idyllic. It's like stepping back in time to visit. So finally, for those of you who are interested in ordering a copy of the book, there are only two places where you can order it. They're both online. And I'm waiting for the slide to find itself here, so bear with me a second. The first is at the website for my firm, carolinahistorical.com/shop. And then there's some material that I wanted to include in the book, but it wouldn't fit. It would have made the book ridiculously long. And that's related to the cemeteries at Robertville and also some surrounding historic sites at Robertville. So I created a website, robertvillesc.com, that contains much of that information. It's free to access and use the website. But you can also purchase a copy of the book at the bookstore at that website. You see the web address there. So with that, I will unshare my screen and go ahead and take any questions that you might have. And Grace, you're welcome to come back anytime if you'd like. So
I think I'm trying to come back. Can you see me?
I can see you.
And you can hear me.
I can hear you.
And you can hear the sound of freedom behind me.
Yes.
I didn't grow up in the Baptist tradition. And when I read your book, I wondered, what exactly does a messenger play in the structure of the Baptist denomination?
Sure. So you have, within the structure of the Baptist Church, you have local associations that are, I shouldn't say local, it's really regional. In this case, for much of the history of Black Swamp and Robertville Baptist, that was the Savannah River Baptist Association. And so that Baptist Association would be made up of a couple dozen churches, depending on what point in time we're looking at. And those churches would rotate where the annual meeting would take place. So that annual meeting might be at Black Swamp one year, or at First Baptist in Savannah in another year. And you would draw together basically all of the churches into a governing meeting to describe and discuss the business of the association. So to not have pandemonium, you would ask the individual churches to send only a few representatives. And those representatives were messengers from the church. They were authorized to speak for the church at that annual association meeting. And so you might have 2 or 3 people, they were usually deacons, but not always, who would go and say, hey, here's our letter telling you how many members we have and how much money we took in last year. Here is our contribution to the association to pay for various mission programs and minutes. And we're also here to vote on behalf of our church on questions of faith or business questions that might come up at the association meeting. So for example, in 1845, when the schism with the Triennial Convention is occurring over slavery, in essence, the association had to vote to embrace the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so you would have had a vote among the members, the churches as members. And as part of that discussion, you would have had those messengers speaking on behalf of the Black Swamp Church. In addition, there were also various business functions that took place in business committees. And you might have one of those messengers from Black Swamp who would serve on a particular committee and not necessarily speak for the church, but help do the work of that committee. So that's kind of a long and involved way of describing that, but does that help?
It does. And I've gotten 2 questions that come in through chat during that. Do we have any idea how Lavinia was educated or who may have educated her?
We really don't know who educated Lavinia. And, we know that she was an enslaved person for sure. We have the transaction receipt from when Joseph Thomas Robert sells her to Alexander J. Lawton, her and her children. So we know that she was enslaved, but we know really very little about her, and census records, unfortunately, are no help at that time.
Yeah.
The slave population schedules tended to list in 1850 enslaved people according to their age. So you would just see in, the Alexander J. Lawton had, 200 enslaved people 35 of them were women between the ages of 30 and 39. And so we can't really trace her very well, and we know nothing about whether she survived the war and what happened to her after the war.
Oh, well, that's sort of sad not to be able to track it, but that's the nature of our business sometimes, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
Do you think that the fact that you are not a member of the church helped you or hindered you during the course of writing this book?
I think it depends on who you ask. So, doing a project like this, I'm a professional historian. And so one thing I really wanted to avoid is what happens in a lot of church histories, where it becomes a record of all the great things that the church did and not a very close examination of the church's more difficult times. And, I have certain ethical standards that I'm obligated as a professional historian to abide by. And one of those is to provide a balanced treatment of the subjects that I'm writing about. And that meant in this book, talking about some things that are difficult. I would imagine that there might be some people who will read this book and see something about their great-great-grandfather that they didn't know and that is alarming or upsetting. And, there's an old saying that if reading history makes you feel warm and fuzzy, or studying history makes you feel warm and fuzzy all the time, you're probably not actually studying history. So in that respect, I think it's difficult because while I'm doing this work, I'm kind of subconsciously aware that I'm annoying somebody down the road. But the other part that's difficult about this kind of work, I think, is so much of the history of this particular church, particularly during the 18th and 19th centuries, is based on oral tradition and word of mouth. And chasing down, I sort of approach things where I look for the three confirmations that journalism at one time also required before they'd print something about somebody. I don't always get three confirmations. And so that turns into sort of a weasel language of some sources suggest, or there is some evidence to suggest,
right,
as opposed to saying things definitively. So that makes this difficult.
Mm-hmm. I have two more questions that have come in from our participants. Do you have any idea where the Black ministers were trained or how they were trained? I mean, there were over 100 of them. That's a lot of folks to get into pulpits.
I suspect that they were probably trained at Black Swamp by the ministers on hand. There was a very patriarchal way with which, and the book talks about this some, it was actually illegal for several decades in the early part of the 19th century for Black church members to worship alone. And that means even with supervision. You couldn't worship with just a white guy hanging out in the back making sure things didn't get out of hand. Even that, under the law in South Carolina, was not permitted. That appears to have been relaxed in practice, even if the law did not change, by about 1840. But that comes with this transition to lots of supervision over Black worship, Black activity, regardless of whether we're talking about enslaved people or free Blacks. Mm-hmm. And since the kind of the pinnacle of these Black ministers being ordained is really in that period from 1830 to 1860, I suspect it was actually a very clever way of maintaining control by saying to the Black community, we're going to allow you to have your own mission churches. We're going to allow you to have your own ministers and deacons. And so you will have the appearance of self-governance, but at the same time, we're going to watch everything that you do, and we expect regular reports from your deacons and ministers on who's showing up to church and not. And the only way to accomplish that training of those Black ministers and deacons is through something very centralized. And I can't imagine that didn't happen at Black Swamp, perhaps using the academy building, given the sheer number of people that would have been involved. So.
Well, back when I was studying master's level history, my thesis was about the weapon always ready to strike, which was the slave code. And that's sort of a same sort of situation here, I think. It just continues throughout Southern history for a very, very long time. One of our participants asked, did you find any information about Gillisonville in your research? Or how much did you run across?
So I wasn't really focused on Gillisonville because Gillisonville had its own churches there. There are, this really was in many ways, a micro history because it's focused specifically on this congregation and the surrounding neighborhood. I sometimes went a little bit beyond that for context, obviously, to statewide Baptist practice and even national Baptist practice where necessary. Gillisonville's role in the history of this church is primarily through the acquisition of the Ascension Church from Gillisonville after the American Civil War. And so I have researched aspects of Gillisonville for the Sherman's March project, obviously, and for some other projects I've worked on, but it wasn't a focus of this book because I wasn't specifically looking for that.
Well, and you had a task ahead of you, which was to concentrate on the church, which sort of brings up this question from me. And I hope some people who might be wanting to write books would think about this. Obviously, the history of the church is important. And because of some of its congregants, it's historically important as well, beyond just the architectural and the denominational history. You put a lot of work into it. You also probably knew that on the great scheme of things, a work of this sort, a nonfiction work concentrating on a rural church in outer St. Peter's Parish, wouldn't necessarily meet a mass market kind of design. I mean, libraries will buy it for sure. But on how did you determine where and how to publish a book that was not likely to appeal to a broad market?
So going into this, the original arrangement with the church, I don't want to get too into the weeds with this, but it was simply to produce a publication-ready manuscript for them. And then it was going to be really the church's job to figure out what they wanted to do with it. In talking about that at great length with Gloria Langford Tootin, who was really my contact for this project, it became clear that it would be easier for everybody if I took on the responsibility of actually getting the book laid out for publication, getting the design of the book done, and that meant hiring a designer, hiring an indexer, doing those kinds of things. And then finding a way to actually publish the book, knowing that the total circulation of the book, I didn't think it would sell more than probably 300 copies. Some of those would be purchased by members of the Lawton and Allied Families Association at their reunion. Some of them would be purchased presumably by members of the church. Some would be, purchased by local historians who have an interest in this, whether they be interested in religious history or just regional history, and libraries, as you mentioned. But there is certainly not a major press in the world that is going to say, sure, we'd love to publish your book that's going to sell 300 copies. They wouldn't even write back if I'd contacted them. And I thought about approaching University of South Carolina Press, but I also know that they are typically looking for a larger return than 300 copies typically in the books that they publish. So that seemed like a non-starter to me, and I wasn't sure that was the best use of the church's time and money to go that route either. And so that left really some form of self-publishing as the way to approach that. And so during the years when this project was emerging, we already had in the early 2000 teens some companies that do what's called print on demand, where you deliver to them a manuscript that is in its laid out, ready to publish form. They don't do any changes to anything. They just say, upload the file, we will print it for you. Tell us how many books you want, and we'll charge you a per copy price to print it for you. So that seemed the best way to approach this. And we went with a company called Blurb for that. Blurb did a good job. There are things that I was unhappy about, but there are always going to be things, depending on, no matter who you pick, that are going to be off about that process. But I think overall they did a really good job with the book. I love the way it looks. And I think it's indistinguishable from a book you would buy from a major press. You can, I think, vouch for that, Grace. You've seen it. So it really does look like any other book you buy in the bookstore. So.
Well, it looks like we're now slightly past our hour time.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to thank you very much, Eric, for being here today. And I think that we can all agree with you that the history of the Black Swamp Baptist and Robertville churches is fascinating and filled with lots of complexities and nuances that, unless you had done the digging, we may not have even realized. So thank you very much. And thank you to all who signed in. We will be posting this to the library's YouTube page within the next day or two. Tell all your friends and neighbors to watch the recording. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.